So we had fighting within the coalition briefly, and that in turn led to this campaign here along the west coast, and I'm about to come into contestation really quickly soon, being stalled. So what we've also seen since the beginning of the conflict, at the beginning, very hard to know what's going on and where, but since 2016, 2017, really sort of a solidifying of many of the key front lines and of the borders, the internal borders within Yemen. And what we've seen is we can describe pretty clearly where fighting is happening and how intense it is. So really you've got sort of the Al Jawf Sadr border here, and really sort of western Al Jawf. You've got Nehm, which is in northeast Sana'a, and you've got Sirwa, which is a part of Marib. And these are sort of the key areas of fighting between these Ali Mohsen Islah forces and what was the Houthi-Saleh alliance, now the Houthis. You've got key flashpoints here on the Saudi-Yemeni border. The Houthis have been trying to hurt the Saudis since the beginning of the war by going across the border and now by firing missiles into Saudi Arabia. And in return, what we've seen is multiple militias, particularly Salafi groups, but now pretty much anyone can lay their hands on, backed by external forces as well, coming in through border crossings at Bakim and Buka, on the Saudi-Yemeni border and trying to cause the Houthis some problems. And then we've got Ali Muslim forces sitting here in Midi on the west coast. Is anyone's head hurting yet, or shall and this is the simple version. So we've got, and that's sort of like one component of the conflict. So that's sort of the intra-northern conflict, if you like, the members of the former regime fighting one another, and now the Houthis fighting against sort of this broad tribal Islah alliance. In Al-Bayda province, we've got this much more complex conflict where we're seeing tribal forces backed by the Ali Mohsen forces, including one or two very small military units fighting against the Houthis, but also particularly here in western Al-Bayda, we're seeing sort of various Al-Qaeda and ISIL groups appearing and fighting against the Houthis as well, and being left largely unmolested by sort of, they're not quite allies, but they're the other anti-Houthi forces. And this is really one of the messiest and most complex bits of the conflict. And then we've got Taz. There will be an updated version of this map within the next month or two when we release a new paper on the south, which will bring much more detail in. And one of the things we're going to show is the internal borders within Taz. But in Taz, one of the key issues is you've got sort of what was the Houthi-Saleh forces, now just the Houthi forces in the northeast of the city and then surrounding the city, but within the city, different cantons of control of different anti-Houthi forces who are not allies. So we have Islah backed groups, we have Salafi fighters, we have Nassery fighters, and then we have military units, two different military units, one broadly Islah affiliated and the other broadly Nasserite affiliated, who are being backed by the UAE along with the Salafis to fight the Houthis, but don't get on particularly well, once again, because of this internal conflict over Islah, with Islah, and have fought each other for control of markets and have engaged in campaigns of assassination against one another. And that's really stalled the conflict. And then finally, what we've seen is since early 2016, forces largely drawn from Lahej, backed by the UAE, pushing up here along the west coast of Yemen. And this is where we've seen some of the key breakthroughs since Saleh's death, when we saw these forces really push up further up than the map shows to about here to a place called Al-Koka. And we've also seen here in Beyhan, in northwest Shabwa, considerable gains against the Houthis. Now, I know that I'm overrunning. I'm going to be super quick in wrapping up. Again, one of the issues that we've seen since the beginning of the war is this storytelling and this narrativizing, and frankly, wishful thinking overtaking realistic policy. So at the beginning of the war, we saw the Saudi-led coalition briefing quite openly to myself, along with sort of diplomats who I interviewed at the time, that the conflict would be ended in a matter of weeks. When Saleh split from the coalition, the story was that he would lead the resistance against the Houthis and they would soon be defeated. And now the story we're being told is, well, everyone hates the Houthis now, so they'll definitely be defeated in 2018, and a military victory is coming. My expectation for the coming months is there is still low-hanging fruit in Yemen. Al-Bayda can be largely taken back from the Houthis. Sabah already has. Kirsh here in Lahej province and Damt here in Al-Dala province can probably be taken back. More progress can be made along the west coast, and Taiz could ostensibly be taken back if all these different forces coordinated and cooperated with one another internally. But then that's your lot. and you end up with the exact same issue that we've had for the past really 2-3 years, which is that we don't have a mediation process or strategy that really allows for the conflict to come to an end. Now, in the recommendations to the report, the key issue, I say, is that we have a peace plan which is based on this old story of two sides. Unless we start thinking about a mediation strategy that brings in all these different players and brings in everyone involved in the conflict and controlling different territory on the ground, we're at one and the same time trying to create further a peace process that has stalled beyond repair. And secondly, we're also leaving lots of people out and creating incentives to spoil. And I'll leave it at that. Sorry for overrunning, Steve.
No, not at all. And before I invite Jerry up, let me ask one question, because what you point to is, I think, is the fundamental dilemma. Even, and you've made this point yourself many times, even if the war against the Houthis were to succeed in some way and they were to be disarmed, then you've won the large war, but you basically opened up the door to a dozen small wars all across Yemen. How do you then entice all of these elements at play in all these other small wars to find a common purpose or a sense of why they should disarm?
Absolutely. I think the first step there is talking to them. Realistically, we've seen some diplomats launch some forays into speaking to, for example, a group called the Southern Transitional Council, which has been formed to bring the various different forces across the south together. It hasn't done the best job in the world, but it's done a better job than any other secessionist group before it. You've got the tribal groups here in the north trying to form something called the Sabah Regional Council. There's a Hadramaut Council, so there are representative constituent bodies which probably aren't that representative or constituent, but they are emerging and they're forming, and there are people and there are point men with whom the UN and others can speak. Now, you can't decide what these people are going to say until you've spoken to them. You can't know what they want out of the conflict until you've asked them that question. And to an extent, we try and break that down.
Who's this?